Howdy bubs and welcome back. Today we're jumping into another GameMaker video, and this time we're going to take a look at adding obstacles to our room, expanding our room, and ensuring that both the player, the enemies, and the projectiles all react to the obstacles within the room. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into our workspace. So over in the workspace, I've made a couple of things already in the background. So starting off, I created a very simple obstacle sprite. It's just a box that changes colors sometimes. That's it, nothing fancy. I've now made the obstacle object. It has no code attached to it, other than the sprite associated with it. And then to actually have the enemy interact with the obstacle in the way that we want the enemy to have to move around the obstacle. They cannot go through it. We're going to, I've commented out the old code. You can remove it in the case that you don't want it anymore. Originally, the code simply tells the enemy to move towards our player at the chase speed. What we're going to replace that with is now it checks if the player exists, then we have a motion plan potential step object. What this is going to do, it is going to try to create a path so that our object is able to avoid a specific object as it moves towards its goal. Its goal in this case is moving towards our player's origin, X and Y, at chase speed, and it's going to avoid obstacles that are in the way. This improves upon this basic code. It's still going to try to go forward in the most direct path. However, if it encounters an obstacle, it'll try to move around it. It's very simple, nothing too crazy, but enough for our purposes in the game. Now that we have this in play, we need to update our player to respect the obstacle as well. Over in my step event, you may have to change this if you have multiple key events, but you either have the extension of your if statement, or in the case of the step events, you have an if statement inside of or in the case of the key events here, you'll have an if statement inside of the key event that'll say, if we are not place meeting at this position, this is the position that the player will move if we press this specific key. If after we move we are not colliding with this object, in this case the obstacle, then we're free to move. The exclamation mark means not. So we check to see if we're pressing the key, or in your case you might have a key event, and as long as we're not colliding with the obstacle after we complete our movement. And so again, with W it's negative movement, with S it's positive movement towards the Y's, with A it is negative movement in X, with D it is positive movement in X. Once we have that confirmed, then we actually perform the movement calculations. With this, we now have both the enemy and the player restricted by the obstacle. Moving into the projectile, I'm going to simply add a collision event, add event collision object with the obstacle. If we collide with the obstacle, we simply destroy ourselves. With those elements in play, our obstacle, sprite, and object being created, the enemy is now moving towards the player, trying to create a motion path that goes around these obstacles, and then our player now performing checks before they do the movement to confirm that we can move without colliding with an obstacle. And then last, with the projectile, if it does collide with an obstacle, it simply destroys itself. We're now ready to start working in the room. Going into the room, I must first create a new instance layer. I'm going to call this layer obstacles. I'm going to place this down below the instance layer. So there's the background, there's the obstacles layer, and then everything else gets added on top. I'm going to specify with my obstacles that I'm working in this layer, and then I can select my obstacle object. Now normally whenever you put something into move, you can left click and drag it in there. That works, but we're gonna have to make a ton of these, so I'm not sure if this is the best use of our time. You can drag one of them in, stretch it out to make a wall. Just be careful you don't accidentally shrink it down because it still exists even if you can't see it, and it is therefore taking calculations and wasting potentially your space. So you can have a single one, drag it out, play around with it as you see fit, but again, that messes with the sprites. If you want to quickly place down a ton, you can left click on the object in question, and then while looking over into the room, hold down Alt, and now you can left click and actually drag to create a little set of walls. Again, this is just a quick example. You can do whatever you want. You can have no obstacles. You can have a couple of obstacles. Your game. This is a very quick and rapid way to create this. But here we can clearly see that the player cannot move through the obstacles. If I fire, the obstacles collide with the walls. And as we can see here, the enemy object is stuck inside of the obstacle and cannot move. Once I move above it, I believe it'll start moving. Oh no, it's stuck the whole way through. There. That enemy can fit, and so it's now trying to path around to get to me. So as we see here, it's working its way over. Again, very simple, nothing too incredibly smart. There's always a risk of the enemy spawning inside an obstacle, but I'll leave that for you as a challenge to address. But now we have a functional obstacle object within the game, and our player, our enemy, and our projectiles all interact with it appropriately. But now I want to make sure my room is bigger. This is kind of a small room to work with. Either I make my sprites tiny or I have to make my room bigger. We have to make a decision. We could technically do both. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to make sure I'm going to left click on my room. We can increase the size of the room as large as you wish. Just keep in mind that everything in the room is used in a lot of the calculations. So for instance, spawning the enemies, they will spawn somewhere in the room. So if you can't see the whole room, it could lead to problems sometimes, especially if they spawn inside of these obstacles if you don't manage to figure out how to block spawning within illegal spaces. So if I'm going to go ahead and increase the size of the room, let me go ahead and double this. 1366 should double up to 2732, and then with a height of 768, that should be 1536. And so now if I zoom out, we see the room has grown double towards the right and double downwards. However, if I were to run this program right now, while it does expand to try to accommodate it, some of your screens might not be capable of expanding this far. My screen is, but I have a very large monitor. If your screen cannot support the full size, we run into a couple of issues and it doesn't quite look as great. So we get portions of it cut off that we just can't see, such as down here. So we're going to have to tweak a couple of settings over here. Over on the left side, by default, the viewports portion is closed. Expand this. We're going to enable viewports, and we're going to make sure viewport 0 is visible. If it's not visible, whenever you hit run, nothing's going to show. If it is visible, it'll lock into this space. So now we remain in the same space we were used to, however, the rest of the room does still exist. We make sure we do a couple of modifications so that way the viewport will follow the player. And that is actually very simple. Over here we have an object following portion, and we simply specify to follow the player object. And we specify how close we get to the borders, so that way the room viewport will follow along with it. And so this says if I'm within 32 pixels of the border, it'll start moving the viewport. I'm going to extend this to be about, let's say 256. Let's try that. So right now everything's good. I start moving downwards and we see the room is moving to accommodate that. We kind of don't have any perspective without having access to obstacles to kind of align to it. But now we can move around the room. We maintain this viewport size, but now our levels are dramatically larger. And because of how we wrote the rest of the code, we still have all of the other portions correctly calculated. I cannot leave the room. Our obstacles will still interact just fine. Our projectiles will be deleted as they leave the room. And I'm still trapped inside. That's why it's very important to ensure that your code is written dynamically, so that way it references values associated with the room properties rather than absolute numbers, such as, for instance, 1366 as being the edge. Instead, we're checking room width as the edge. So when we double this, we don't have to change anything in our code because it's already grabbing whatever the maximum size of the room is. But there you go. Now you have a wonderful system for creating obstacles. You can expand your room, and you can enable a camera to follow your player as they travel around the edges of the viewport. If you have any questions or need any assistance, just let me know in class. Otherwise, that's all we've got today. Everyone have a good one. I just wanted to say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Shout out to my bad bubs, my top 5, my day ones. Y'all have always been there for me. Next up, my baby bubs, the next 5. I always love y'all's support. And finally, for everyone else, any little bit helps. Thank you to all my basic bubs for supporting me along my journey. If you want to continue receiving notifications, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell button.